All right, we are back. It is Friday with another episode of Learning Tech Talks, where we are exploring the landscape of learning technology while cutting through all of the fluff to get you the questions answered you need answered. So today is going to be a fun one, and we're having some technical difficulties getting started here, but we figured it out. Believe it or not, I had to go onto Wi-Fi and off the hardwire, which that defies all logic. So we'll see what other logic we can defy on today's show. So I'm joined by James Watson, and we are going to be talking about virtual reality. Yes, virtual reality is going to be the topic of conversation, but we'll see where it goes. But before we get into that conversation, let's get everybody who's joining. We've got probably one of the biggest Learning Tech Talks registrations of all time. So no pressure, James. No pressure, but we cannot let down the over 1,000 people who have registered to listen to this conversation. So, hey, with that, let's get them involved, but also let's get you involved. So for those of you watching, comment and share where you are in the world today. James, where are you today?
So I'm down near Brighton.
Okay. You're gonna have to go more specific. That Brighton, that's pretty specific. Okay,
sorry,
all right. You're in the UK and Brighton. Yeah, that's remember we got a global audience here, James. Brighton, that'd be like me saying I grew up in Renville. I'd have no idea what he just said. All right, so I am in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where I always am, and let's see. So let's shift gears and move to our ice question. You've had a little bit of time to think about this. I'm actually really curious to hear the story behind this. And everybody you can play along. I'm curious to see your answers to this as well. But James, what is the strangest gift you've ever received?
The strangest gift. It's quite an easy one for me because it's something that will never be repeated. But I was once given an alpaca.
An alpaca. Okay, you can't just go alpaca. That's it. Thank you. No, there's got to be some of the story behind this. Do you still have the alpaca?
No, I thought it was a one-word answer. So no. So
you can't get off that. I get to ask follow-up questions. This is my show.
So to cut a very long story short, my parents lived down in Devon. And there was a farm near them that was struggling a little bit. It was an alpaca farm, and he was looking to kind of get these things adopted. So they adopted 2 alpacas, and one of them was gifted to me. He is still, as far as I know, doing very well. He's no longer, under my ownership. And so I, didn't last very long. It was a couple of years, but yeah, I was an alpaca owner. It was a birthday thing.
Wow. Did you even have, so when they were you living on a farm or something like that where they were like, you've got a place to put this? Or were you just like, I don't know, put it in your backyard?
I figured that they just thought, well, he's in marketing. He's obviously going to be good with
alpaca. He's in marketing. He must have a place for an alpaca.
He must know how to look after an alpaca. But no, the alpaca stayed on the farm, and it was just kind of like
okay, so it was like you didn't have to bring it home. It was just, hey, this is kind of yours, an honorary alpaca.
But we'd go down and visit him and feed him and stuff, So yeah, it was part of the family briefly.
Oh my goodness. Okay, well that was not what I was expecting. This is why I love not getting the answer before we go live, because it's always fascinating. I have much better follow-up questions when an alpaca. Okay, what was it? You know what? I will just end up making the show about how James Watson got an alpaca. So I'm just going to stop right there, and we'll leave that as the strangest gift you've ever received. People can watch the live replay if they want to hear more about that. Mine, and before we get into it, so mine is kind of, I had to think about this a little bit, and I went back to, I was probably midway through college or university, and it was my birthday, and my parents, I opened this present and it's a giant floodlight. And I'm looking at it going like, what were you think? Like, what do you think I'm doing that I need this? It was like a 5,000 candle watt. You had to plug this thing into the wall. It was so powerful. And I remember just getting it and going, I have no idea why you would be a good idea. So not nearly as interesting or as exciting as the alpaca. But yes, an odd gift nonetheless.
You could use it to spot the alpacas at night.
Why were we not together?
I
Why are
could
we
have
not
used that.
Taco? Imagine the things we could have done. We could have, well, you know, hindsight's always 2020. So
Wonderful thing.
anyway, all right. So let's shift gears over to the topic of virtual reality. But as we get into it, your marketing, you said that, which is why you got the alpaca, because they thought marketing, alpaca, clear correlation between these two.
Exactly.
But give me a little bit of background into this. How did you get, as a young child, did you think to yourself as you were looking through your viewfinder, you know what I want to do? I want to do virtual reality, but I want to do marketing for VR. How did you even get there?
I was trying to work out how to put alpacas in VR, but no, I mean, so I got there. It was a particular instance. So I've been in sort of marketing previous to getting into VR and immersive tech for, you know, about 15 years. But I came across a really interesting example of VR that kind of just got me really hooked into it, which was using VR for pain relief.
Okay.
And this is something, it was a chap called Hunter Hoffman and David Patterson who did this. This was 20 years ago they did this. It's not when I saw it, but 20 years ago they were using VR to basically put on children having their burns dressed to relieve pain. And I saw it and I thought, how can that work? And it works basically by overloading the brain. So the brain has to work out, do I focus on the pain or do I focus on this VR environment, which was a snowball game, deliberately a cool environment when someone is having burns dressed. And I just remember thinking, and it had like, you know, it was as effective as opioids. And if combined with opioids could actually, you know, increase the overall pain relief. And I just remember thinking that's one of the most phenomenal uses of technology I've ever seen. You know, it was helping the pain of these kids. And I just thought, wow, if it can do that, what other things can this technology do? And it was from then on in, I was just like, I need to know more about it. And I was lucky enough to be working at an experiential marketing agency at the time who was interested in VR and how that might play out from a sort of marketing perspective. And I moved in that way. So it was really kind of that one sort of example that just made me think, this is incredible technology. Where else can it go?
Okay. Well, and I remember reading, and I mean, they've done a lot of things in that, especially in the healthcare space. But I remember back, I think sometimes people think VR is this new, you know, came out in 2018, and it's not. It's been around for quite a while. Now, granted, it's come a long ways. But I remember some of those early use cases being fascinating in terms of what does it do actually in your, I mean, it really truly is messing with you. So it was not a childhood dream is what you're saying.
It wasn't a childhood dream, but subsequently I'm kind of just, it's a real passion of mine. And so, you know, if you find something you're passionate about, make a job out of it, then, you know, it was either going to be technology or sport. And I'm not very good at sport. So I'm sticking with technology.
Maybe you could, I promise I won't keep coming. Maybe you could have, you know, taken over an alpaca farm. Maybe that could have been the start of everything.
Yeah, I mean, not very heavy on the technology, but I could have, you know, installed.
That would have been neither sports nor tech, but either way.
True. Maybe next time.
So, but I am curious because especially in marketing, and I think this is one of the things why I was excited to talk to you about it, is that VR is, I think for a lot of people, it's a bit of a confusing space. We talked a little bit about the fact that people think it's this futuristic and it's for these very specific niche use cases. But even just in terms of defining it, when people talk to you and they say, hey, you know, what is virtual reality? How have you come up with a snappy way to articulate that to people so that because people define it a lot of different ways?
Yeah, and it's quite funny really because, you know, people get hung up within the sort of, you know, immersive tech sector. People get hung up is 360-degree video on a headset. Is that VR? Well, no. Some people say it's not VR because VR is actually a completely, you know, synthetic environment that is created that you go into, and you know, and there can be lots of debates about it. And I get to a point where the outside world doesn't really care. Right, no. The outside world doesn't care if they put a headset on and they are in a 360 video and they're flying above Niagara Falls. They are going to be wowed and it's incredible. And they'll go, I've just tried VR. That's incredible. But actually, some people say, no, that's not VR. So
the apologetics of virtual reality, right? I mean, it's a fair point. I think sometimes when you're too close to it, you start debating, well, technically virtual reality is only if it
People
meets
get
these
passionate
70
about it.
criteria.
Yeah, people get passionate about it, and I just get to a point, go, so what? Because I'm always looking at the market, right? So what do they care? Is it important that you differentiate? And the answer is no, it isn't important. And how I would describe VR is it's a completely virtual environment that is completely sealed off from the outside world. So you put one of these on, little Oculus Quest here, put that on, and you are in a completely.
Technically, that's the Quest 2, though, isn't that?
Yeah, it's the Quest 2. Yeah,
okay, I could go get my Quest. We could have a see. We could start apologetics debating right now about which one's what.
Try and switch it over, but yeah. So it's a completely virtual world, and within that world, you can be doing anything, right? I mean, people get confused: VR, AR, MR, XR. There's too many acronyms in here, really. Yes. VR is you're in a completely sealed off virtual environment. Simple. Augmented reality. It's overlaying stuff on the real world that you can see the real world. It's really simple.
Okay. All right. It's so simple. There's a lot of complexity behind this, but I think, yeah. And I think that's one of the things that I have seen. We really have to, I think sometimes this is where we can get wrapped up in our own side of it instead of thinking about what is it to the consumer. Similar kind of parallel. So I fly, I've got a whole bunch of DJI, I say drones because that's what I call them, because people go, oh yeah, those things that fly around that, are controlled somewhere else. Some people will flip out and freak out and go, that's not a drone. That is a quadcopter. You cannot call it a drone. And it's one of those things where it's like, but if we're talking to the general populace, they don't know the difference in all these categories. And it actually creates tremendous confusion for them.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it is. And, just think about the bigger market and how people understand this thing. Think about how you tell your parents about it. Are you going to tell your parents it's a quadcopter or a drone, or are you going to tell them it's 360 video or it's VR, but they're different,
Okay. So I will ask one follow-up question though, because would you consider VR to truly be headset required, right? Totally immersive, because there are some, and I know some of the guests on here, right? They would consider themselves in the VR space, but it doesn't require a headset. You can go into a virtual environment, not necessarily headset. So where do you draw the line?
Ooh, I mean, when you say a virtual environment, you mean what? Like, a 3D environment on a laptop?
Yes. So 3D. So
that's not VR. Definitely, it's easy. Okay. Not VR.
Okay. Not VR. All right. No, that's fair. Because all right. Well, and somebody said, let's see. Nathan said, if James says it, then it is. So if James says that it requires a headset to truly be VR, then we will for the sake of definition on the show, we will say it is immersive with a headset.
But if you want to put a slight nuance on that, you do have caves, right? Which is like an enclosed sort of room with projectors that brings.
Now we're getting really technical.
So is that virtual reality? Once again, the purists would say no. I think it gets a bit murky, but I would definitely say virtual reality to me is you have to have a real level of immersion that you wouldn't get looking at a flat screen.
Okay. Yeah. And again, I think this is where, especially as technology continues to evolve, the lines continue to get a little bit blurred. Like you said, the caves where it's like, well, technically you don't have a wearable on, but you have gone into a truly immersive environment that is taking you outside. And I think that's a fair point. When we say VR, we're saying it's truly taking you out of your reality into a separate one.
And I think it'll become simpler as there are more headsets in circulation. People will just go, oh yeah, VR, it's a headset. I think it will probably just sort itself out over time as usage increases.
Yeah. Well, and Matt brought up a good point, and I think this is something that will lead to a second question I have, which is that vernacular does, while we kind of chew this around and argue back and forth within our own spaces, that's now pouring into the consumer market, and the consumer is not as close to all of this stuff, which does create some additional confusion, because then it's like, well, you see the same thing with AI. People are hearing AI thrown around and everything, and they're like, what is AI? So with that actually kind of leads me to my second question, because you've been in the space for quite a bit when it comes to this VR. And I would say my experience and just kind of watching this industry and just this capability, there have been some starts and stops and kind of bumps along the way in terms of its general acceptance, its general adoption. What have you seen as VR has continued to evolve? What are some of those things that maybe have led it to not being quite as mainstream as it could be today?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. There's been a lot of stops and starts. I think luckily at the moment we're in a start, but that's not to say it won't kind of, ebb and flow a little bit. There's a really interesting thing called Amara's Law, which is basically we massively overestimate the impact of technology in the short term and then really underestimate the effect of that in the longer term, right? So you get all this hype around a new technology comes out, think this is going to change the world. Actually, there's been too much hype. The technology isn't really up to doing what it says it's going to do. And suddenly everyone's really disappointed and thinks it's rubbish. But then over time, the technology does actually get implemented. It does improve and it has fundamental impact. So I think VR's kind of been in that space a bit. You see, there's every year there's an article, is VR dead? And you're sort of like, well, hang on a sec, I wasn't sure it was fully alive, but and suddenly now it's dead. Another problem is that people talk and they don't understand what they're saying at all. It's like, what's the killer app for VR? And I hear that, I heard that a lot, less so now. And I'd be like, what do you mean by killer app? And they wouldn't really know. It's just like a soundbite. Just like something you'd say, what's the killer app that's going to take it mainstream? But the big problem was everyone was looking at VR going mainstream for the consumer market, right? It was all about when is everyone going to have a VR headset in their home? A bit like back in the day, everyone's going to have a 3D printer in their home. Guess what? Have you got a 3D printer in your home, Christopher?
I don't. I've debated it a few times. I'm like, all I'm going to end up doing is printing a bunch of junk. And I've got 5 kids, so I'm just going to have more trinkets to step on laying around the house. So no, I don't. So
that was a calculated risk because I did think you could have one, but I figured, I'm hoping not. But yeah, so think about 3D printers, right? Everyone's kind of banging on about that back in the day. Amazon, you're going to get your order from Amazon, and you're going to print it. You're going to print it in your home, And so there was all that hype around that, and that ultimately didn't really get to where it expected to. Once again, back to Amara's Law. So the key point being is it was always thinking about when's it going to take off for the consumer market, when is going to be mass adoption, which is just unrealistic even still. When this headset is $300 or whatever, you're not going to have mass adoption. And so I think that was a big problem. But what's happened, I would say, in probably only the last couple of years is there's been a realization within the sector that the consumer market is a way off. Until Apple bring out some fabled, beautiful piece of kit that kind of looks like some glasses and you flip it into VR mode and then you flip it into AR mode, which is a long way off, although depending on who you listen to, but it's quite a long way off.
I'm sure in the comments we'll get lots of feedback on that one.
There's something coming. I don't think it's going to change the world. It'll look beautiful and cost a load of money, but I'm not sure it's going to change the world. But so in that space, it was a case of saying, well, you have to wait for where is the proper market? Where is the real market now? And it's enterprise. It's all those those amazing training examples, the medical examples you talked to. So the market kind of just went, oh, okay, let's not wait for the killer app for consumer because that's not in the next 5 years realistically. But hey, look at all these huge enterprises who are screaming out for better training, better learning and development, better employee engagement. Oh, hang on a sec. There are some real core use cases there. So, and if you look at a lot of the coverage in the past year, most of the coverage now is about enterprise. They don't talk so much about consumer. There is talk about consumer because of this headset, which has really revolutionized the whole market. But it's really people have gone, okay, that's a little way off. Enterprise, that's where we should focus.
Okay. Well, and so let me, because I've got a point of view on this, although I don't think I have the cred that you do on it. So I don't think what I say will immediately become fact. But, I think to some regards, some of the futuristic nature type stuff we've put around it, I've actually seen makes people feel like, oh, this is way out there. This is this ubiquitous, kind of distant. I don't really see a practical. It's actually almost kind of distanced it from practical type. Hey, this is the kind of stuff you can do with this stuff. It's for video games, and you can maybe use it for if you really want to have a cool movie experience on Netflix, but it's not really practical, which I think is unfortunate, because even for myself, I've got a couple of these things, and I've taken my kids on. I can't go anywhere with 5 kids. Literally, I can't go anywhere, but I can in VR. And so in solving a real problem for me, it has allowed me to bring experience, because we can go places together. And yes, it's kind of dorky. We're standing around in, and things, but we can see each other and we can explore environments. And it's been a very practical. Now, granted, to your point, I think some of the latest hardware has democratized that and made it more practical. But I do think in general, people still have kind of this, it's kind of weird and quirky. It's not everyday stuff, at least on the consumer side.
Yeah. And I think that's fair. I think you're right. Absolutely. And the majority of people, if you ask them in the street, they'll say, oh yeah, that's for gamers, right? That's for gaming.
That's what most people attribute it to on the consumer side. Well, I don't really play video games. Well, you can do a lot more with a VR headset. I mean, I've been doing VR drone flying for quadcopter flying for a while, right? Stuff like that. But I mean, again, I think the possibilities it unlocks are huge. Now, on the enterprise side, I'm curious your take, because I've got a pretty distinct point of view on this, but I'm curious your take, because even on the enterprise side, aside from some of these very specific use cases, I do still see some like, I don't know. I'm not really sure that I can really see the value of this. So I'm curious what your experience has been, especially on the marketing side, even getting penetration into the enterprise.
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenge we have, right, is, when you're as close to the technology as I am, you do have to pull yourself out sometimes and go, okay, but what does the market think? And it's really dangerous to get, really carried away with the technology for technology's sake. So, and sometimes it's quite hard to keep that balance, because you believe in the technology, you see the potential, so you just think it can kind of solve pretty much anything if you try hard enough. And so it is a challenge, but what you're seeing in the enterprise sector is, and what's the challenge? The big challenge has been, there's been a lack of data. It's quite simple, right? Because what's killed it a lot of the time, Christopher, is the fact that, you'll hear about this project rolled out by some big global organization, and the feedback will be, the people who took part in the pilot felt they could do their job better. And that's it. And that is just a killer, because it's like, well, of course they think they can do their job better, because they just tried this incredibly cool tech. There's someone who has a run-of-the-mill job that isn't that inspiring. They normally train looking at some PowerPoint or some, and they've just tried this amazing piece of kit. Yeah, they're going to think they can do their job better. And that used to drive me mad, to be honest, because I felt that was actually doing the technology a disservice. I'd rather not even sort of talk about people, felt it's going to help them, because there isn't the data. But the data is coming out now.
The data's coming.
It's getting there now. And I've got some really interesting stats that I came across recently, and this will really drive the sector, particularly enterprise. But there's a brilliant example that I talked about recently, which is the US Air Force working with a company called Sketchbox. They've put their C-19 training, the big cargo planes with the nose that lifts up, and they put some of their training into VR, and they basically shortened the time by 25% to get one of these cargo loaders qualified. So you shorten the time by 25%. That apparently equates somewhere in the region to a saving of $100,000 per trainee. I mean, this is expensive training, right?
Yes.
And when you start getting into that, and that represents 9% of the training course at the moment. They're planning to make it 40% VR, which is pretty phenomenal. Those things, and I think that training with the C-19 aircraft or what have you, I don't think it is that niche. Yeah, that piece of kit is niche. The piece of kit is niche, but it is a procedure, and that procedure could be a production line, it could be a warehouse, it could be anything. And I think that has been my bugbear that all along is we don't have the data. The data is now coming out, and that is then going to drive the sector, and all those conversations about, well, headsets are expensive. Well, headsets are expensive, but if you're going to save $100,000 per trainee,
if you're going to save $100,000 a person by sending them a $900 headset, that's a pretty good. Well, and I think the point that you're bringing up is one that I think is critical for people in learning and development to think about, because there's two factors to it. And one of it is I have been relentless about the fact that we need to get better at focusing on experience as part of what I say development. I think sometimes when people think training, they think, oh yeah, we told people, or we communicated, we gave them the content. And when you're developing people, that's a very small percentage of the actual equation. The actual experience itself is the impactful piece, as you just highlighted in the example of, okay, we were able to get people to perform this task X% faster because we got them in the experience portion quicker and more efficiently. And I think that, to me, is where VR is extremely powerful, in the sense that you can package experience, which has historically been extremely difficult for us to do, extremely difficult, cost prohibitive, resource prohibitive, things like that, to say, how do we give people experience? Well, we don't really have a good way to do it. So we'll, I don't know, try and assign a mentor in the field, or we'll maybe, I don't know what, we'll just give them some tips and tricks and hope they can do that. And what VR is doing is saying, you can now create experience, you can give people experience, you can measure experience. But before you even get there, you actually have to fundamentally make the mindset shift to focus on experience. Because if you don't, then you're figuring out, well, how can we push content to people in VR? Well, that's not the point. That is not the point. That's a gimmicky, now we can get them to watch our e-learnings in their headsets. Like,
yeah, what? I mean, that's the classic. If you try and just replicate what you're doing now and jam it into a new technology, you should really leave.
Just sign off the show.
But what you're saying about the experience, right? What in essence, what you're saying, and how I distill it down, is it's learned by doing. Is it,
that's
right?
Exactly it.
It's learned by doing. And once again, without sounding like the VR evangelist or going too nuts, it's like, you can put someone in any scenario in VR and it will feel very real.
Yes.
You can put someone in a major industrial oil spill and they have to complete 3 key procedures. And if they can do those within 60 seconds, they will avert a major disaster. And you can put them in that environment and see how they react. And that's different to putting them in the real world environment, because you're not having flames or things blow up or anything around them. And so,
not the environment you want to put people in.
Yeah, I mean, obviously you don't want to traumatize people too much, but equally, if they're going to flake out when it happens in reality, you don't want that to be your safety guy on the ground. So there is, that learn by doing, is one of the core benefits of using this technology, because you can create any scenario. You can create a once in 40 year scenario. A once in 40 year scenario that, when it does happen, it can be cataclysmic. Well, how do you role play that? How do you do anything? Well, put them in VR. You can have multiple people in there. You can have trainers watching. It's just very powerful when you look at it like that.
Well, and I think what you're getting at, and I think this is the thing where sometimes I often, it's a little bit of a joke, but it's kind of not of a joke, in that I feel like sometimes we have a little bit of Stockholm syndrome, right? We just kind of keep going back to what we know, the comforts that we have, even though we're in a dingy prison cell with moldy bread. It's like, there is a reality outside of this that is vastly different if you can step outside of it. And to your point, there are no rules with virtual reality. So some of the things that we go, man, there'd just be no way we could coordinate this kind of event. Well, yes, you can. Yeah. Now, the thing that Carlos asked that I think is interesting, and I'd love your take on this as well, is I think sometimes it's easier for people to quantify or kind of compartmentalize. Okay, I can think about that for maybe a safety simulation, or if you're on a manufacturing floor, things like that. But maybe I'm responsible for soft skills or, leadership type training. And to me, my response to that is, and you can simulate that same type of thing when you actually take the time to break down what does that experience look like? What is this situation that's happening that you need to recreate at scale, and you need to truly immerse people in it so that they can get the same experience they would if they actually went through it.
Yeah, I mean, and if you'd spoken to me a year ago, or maybe a little bit longer, I was really skeptical of that kind of soft skills. If you think soft skills, hard skills, more procedural versus those softer kind of diversity and inclusion, leadership, what have you. I was really skeptical of that because the challenge there is, you can take data out of hard skills, right? You can say someone has to complete 8 steps within a certain amount of time, and there's a tolerance of they're allowed to get 2 wrong, and yada yada. Did they do it? Yes, no, yes, yes. Okay, fine. You put someone in a soft skills environment, and it's a diversity and inclusion piece, and they're sat around a table and they have to react. You look at how they react. That becomes much woollier, right? That's a little bit more. You can measure, but it's a bit more subjective. However, to your point, it still has massive value, right? Because you can put someone, it can be dealing with a difficult customer. The challenge there's Immersion, actually, who I know you've spoken to before. Yep. Immersion do some interesting stuff on that soft skills stuff as well. But I think it depends on the level of immersion in it, how good it is. If you're looking at this scary, uncanny valley avatar who kind of keeps looking a bit askew and kind of, odd, you're not really going to feel that you're present, and there's someone who's unhappy with your level of service and you're trying to placate them. That's not going to work. As things improve, as those avatars become more sophisticated, which they are rapidly, as they look better, as you bring in a little bit of, to misuse another terminology, a bit of AI in there, and and they're able to react in different ways, and it's less of a decision tree thing. It's something that has that really, really does become of great value. So that whole soft skills area is, I mean, if you think about the world we live in now, and the need for those soft skills across all sorts of different areas, there are probably more companies looking at soft skills in VR than hard skills at the moment.
Well, and I think to your point, it's a maturity of the capabilities. Now, I've done a fair amount of work with, and again, if we want to get into the details of was it VR, was it not VR, we don't need to go there. But immersive experiences for soft skills, I found that there were really 2 components that made a difference in this, in making it successful. So to your point, I had explored this for soft skills early on, and it felt very robotic. You were interacting with, this AI bot that didn't necessarily feel very realistic. And so it really ended up feeling like a really over-the-top Q&A question answer type thing in an e-learning, where this robot presented you with this weird archaic thing, and then you clicked a button and then it responded robotically based. And it was like, I probably could have done this in an e-learning. Now, where that's changed is, I think, this kind of hybrid blend of human in the loop and technology, where there is a virtual layer, but you're still interacting with a human, where you're taking them a little bit out of it, and it is a more dynamic. And I think to your point about the models themselves not feeling so bizarre, that they truly feel, okay, it's close enough that I'm actually, and I think the CEO from Immersion, what does he call it? Suspended disbelief, I think is the term they use, where it's close enough that it's actually tricking you into thinking you are here. And I think that's been a really important point, is to make sure that that environment replicates the environment close enough, especially if you're dealing with soft skills, that it does feel like a human interaction. I think the other thing, Immersion's on here, they're like, yes, that's why we use human in the loop. So, but I think the other thing, and this is the part on the learning leaders and the learning teams that are doing this, when you're dealing with soft skills, you actually have to unpack the experience itself to be able to say, and this goes to your point about the quantification of it. Is it easier to quantify how did somebody do if they went through a procedure? Yes, because it's task driven, it's things like this. If it's an interaction with a human, you actually really have to decrypt what is a good experience look like for that human. Because when you do, there actually are components you can say, well, if I'm having a discussion with James, then these are the behaviors we want to be looking for in that interaction. Kind of like an SOP. Did Christopher do this? And this is what good looks like versus bad looks like. Did this? And if you actually get those behavioral metrics, I've done it. You can have some pretty powerful data coming out of here saying we were able to simulate this experience and quantifiably measure whether or not a person was able to perform certain things in the soft skills arena.
And there's some, it's less soft skills, but it's kind of between soft skills and hard skills. There's some really interesting work going on in like executive leadership training.
Yep.
Whereby they're putting people into multi-user VR environments and giving them tasks. So you're kind of testing it's task-based, but it's also how they operate as teams. And they're also overlaying psychometric testing in there and building all that in. And that then becomes really interesting as well, because that's almost like it's kind of seeing how people react doing a task, but you're more interested in the reaction than the task. So it's almost like a combination of that soft and hard skills piece, which I think is only going to go on to become more and more important as, distributed workforces, cost implications, everything. Why wouldn't you do that? And also, more engaging training. So it kind of wins on a number of fronts.
It does. And I think that's where, when I hear people say, well, VR is only for operations or safety training, I say, I would disagree. I would argue against that and say, no, I think you're limited in your thinking of experience and to your point, or practice or whatever you want to call it. You're thinking only about things that you can quantify in that sense. And I think there's ways to quantify this. But this actually gets me to the next point that I want to talk about is this data side of things. Yeah. Because this is accelerating ridiculously fast in terms of what we can even detect and what kind of data we can pull. I mean, ocular movements, stress levels now with haptics, like there is so much data that we're capturing. Yeah. I'm curious how you're seeing, kind of that rapidly evolve. I'd love your take on how that data piece is accelerating.
Yeah, I mean, if you think there's sort of core buckets of data, right? So within VR, you can you can now with certain headsets and other sensors you can add in. There's full haptic body suits as well from people like Tesla suit and what have you. So you can get all those biometrics, which is really important in any environment, soft skills or hard skills, right? How did someone react when pump number 3 shut down and then 4, 5, and 6 went? Oh, wow, look at their heart rate, look at their where they're looking, are they looking in the right direction? So eye tracking, but also in soft skills, as that angry avatar who maybe isn't perfectly lifelike but starts shouting in someone's face, still had an impact, right? They still so you've got those biometrics. You've also movement. Every single movement can be tracked in VR, which is amazing and scary. I think.
Well, the thing about it is we actually can capture more data on things in this space than we can in real life, if you think about it, because it's like everything has a data point, which to your point is exciting and terrifying.
Exciting and terrifying. Everything. So there's even it takes you into this whole sort of like, wow, you've got all that data, right? So you can then start from VR. You can. I've read stuff about where you can work out by someone's walk in VR who that person is in real life. So someone could go and do something in VR and take some training, and then you could have some, CCTV cameras around or whatever, and they go, oh yeah, that's so-and-so because we've got the walk from. So, but that's getting into a sort of weird data cyber
we'll
security.
Go there. If we have time, we're going to go there a little bit. I won't go too far down the rabbit hole, I promise.
Because that does. I mean, I think we shouldn't get too worried about how scary the data is yet until we understand the data, and the data isn't necessarily being captured to that level yet, and what have you. But yeah, so movement, biometrics, voice. There's voice in VR. You're talking to people in VR as well. You're not just in this sort of like mute world. You can be talking and saying, okay, I'm going to go do this, and talk to the avatar or talk to fellow trainees or fellow participants in there. So you got voice as well. So the data piece of it is incredible. It's something I bang on about a lot, because if you don't have the data, you really haven't got any way of proving the return on investment, the value. You go to your CFO and ask for more money. He's like, well, what's it done for the business?
Right. It looks like just a more expensive version of what you're doing if you don't have that data.
And then you're gonna soon find you lose your backing for that. So it's such an important part. The challenge as well is, you can have too much data. Data is only as good as the decisions that are made coming out of that data, that sort of business analysis piece. And so you have to be really careful. I think a lot of companies out there have data dashboards, and they're like, yeah, all this data. And it's like, well, what does it mean? What does it mean to GE or Shell or DA? What does it mean to these people? You've got to have meaning to it. So it's going to evolve. We're still at that relatively early stage. There's more companies looking to roll out VR, particularly in the training arena. As they roll it out, they're going to be asking more demands of their suppliers. Well, hang on, what about, we'd like to know about this, or, well, if you split the data like this, how about we get this result out of it? So the market will kind of drive it, but there is, everything is measurable within it. So you can do everything and anything with that data if you use it in the right way.
Well, and I think, and there's a couple comments that came in that I'm going to bring up that I think will spark some discussion with this. But I think what's important about this, and this is where this whole ethical moral dilemma comes into play, is there's a lot that you can capture. I mean, literally everything. You can get to know kind of the inner workings of people.
Yeah.
Honestly, in some ways, even better than they may realize, because they might not even quite know how they're responding, and you're going to have all this data on it. And I think that can be dangerous territory if you're just like, let's just capture it all. Let's just get it all and see what happens. And I think that goes back to the starting with the end in mind and saying, what are we trying to accomplish with this so that we know what data we need to tell that data story? And it's also going to help inform, what do you need out of your partners who are designing these simulations? So as an example, I think of for soft skills, the advancements in natural language understanding is massive for what we do in learning and development in terms of being able to real-time analyze people's language and actually understand what people are saying. We can detect the tone, the sentiment, we can detect stress levels. All these kinds of things can help us start to develop people in a way where we say, we actually have data on how you perform in this, but you need to start with this first and say, what are you trying to get people to perform for, so you can back into what capabilities and data do you need? And I think the comment I was going to bring up is, movement pattern recognition is another one of those, like natural language understanding, where you say that's extremely powerful, but you need to know, what do you need to do with that information first? And is it relevant? Is it pertinent, what we're trying to do, so that we can back into a solution that's using that to help us tell that story?
Yeah. And there's a huge onus on, the organizations that own the data, right? There's a huge moral obligation to use it in the right way. And I think you're right. And I think it's an area that's going to get a lot more attention over the coming years, particularly in the VR sphere, because as people start to understand what can be captured, because people haven't really got there yet.
No.
They haven't really got. But when they realize, like you said, everything is captured, you're going to get people go, oh, hang on. There's going to be like clauses in contracts and all sorts now going, which we'll have to address it. But we're not quite there yet, but we'll get there, because guess what? That data is going to be mined to within an inch of its life, because it's going to be hugely valuable.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's where there's an opportunity for us to get in front of that. Let's not wait until the regulations come into play or there are those contract clauses, because then at that point you're reacting and responding to this. Because to your point, I think a lot of the workforce doesn't understand how much data, even, let's not even talk VR, how much data they're generating that is being captured and stored and managed somewhere that's actually telling a very detailed story of who you are. Now you throw VR into that mix. That's a really powerful story about you. Where did you look? How much time did you spend doing this? How did you move? How did you respond? That is some very personal things that I think that's why it's important when we start treading into this space to be very intentional about that and how we're approaching it.
For sure.
But I think from a learning standpoint, again, what can be used that can be scary can also be used in very great ways. And I think one of the comments somebody made earlier is, when you think about this for adaptive learning, we've talked about adaptive learning in terms of adaptive content, I would say. We've changed the pathways in which people can experience content. I think VR is opening the door to say, we can actually change the pathways for which people experience experiences. And we can say, based on your performance, we can actually mold and shape your experience to get there. So I'm curious, with that, as you look, let's say James Watson, make a prediction, 3 to 5 years. Where do you think some of the biggest trends or advancements, where are we going to see this really moving as you kind of watch the space? And I'm sure everybody's going to have some insights and intake based on all the comments, but I'm curious, what's your take in the next 3 to 5 years? And that's pretty far out, I get it, but where would you see some of the big things going?
I mean, there's a few fundamental factors that will really affect the overall uptake of the technology, right? So, the obvious one is the hardware. The hardware, like we said, $300 now for an Oculus Quest, which I think is pretty good value. That's going to keep coming down. So the cost of that coming down is not only going to open it up to more consumers, it's going to open it up to more businesses. Because despite the wonderfully big figure I gave for the US Air Force of 100,000 saving per trainee, it's not going to be like that for every organization. So the hardware is not only going to become cheaper, it's going to become better. It's going to become lighter. All these things. We'll go back to the Apple thing. I'm sure, like you said, there'll be people commenting about that, but that will change.
We've already started the rumor mill. Somebody already said, wait, Apple's coming out with a VR device?
Well, is it VR? Is it mixed reality? We don't know. And, the rumor mill is going hard at that, and I'll leave that to run itself. But
let's not fuel that one.
Yeah, let's not. I don't think it needs fueling. It's crazy. In fact, there was one graphic artist has jumped on the bandwagon, and when the first rumor started coming out a few weeks back, they basically mocked up what they thought it would look like. So it's like a cool little thing, and it's ridiculous. It's really thin, and it's just never going to look like that. And they sell the rights to the image for like $90.
Oh,
so this thing they have made up. They've just stuck an Apple logo on it, and now they're selling it for $90 a pop, which I mean, that's kind of genius, right? I mean, you're making money out of nothing. So from a marketing perspective, well done you. I wouldn't suggest buying it. So the hardware is going to make a big difference. Also 5G, which people talk about a lot, a bit like AI, I think. People are like, yeah, 5G. Well, what does it mean? They're like, well, better. I mean,
5G, big data, AI. It's one of those things.
It's better than 4G because it's a 5. So, 5's better, isn't it? So you've just increased it by
by 1.
But yeah, by 25% or whatever. But that will have an impact on VR as well, because it's going to reduce latency. So 10 times less latency, and also you can increase the amount of content you can stream into a headset. So back to your sort of the point about adapting environments. Well, you're going to be able to do a lot of stuff on the fly. So maybe like in a training environment, someone makes a decision, and based on that, as a completely different scenario comes into play. That would be a bit of a challenge at the moment. With 5G, it's going to make it easier. So that's a big one. And I think where the market is really fundamentally changing is, look at the situation we're all in currently. It's different levels of lockdown. It's an obvious one, but remote working. I mean, my view is that this has been a mass enforced experiment. And for some companies, it's been painful. For other companies, it's been quite enlightening. But wherever we get to, as we move, vaccinations rolling out, that's all very positive, and we'll get beyond this. But what you will have is the expectations of employees will have fundamentally changed.
Yeah.
There's an expectation from pretty much every employee that they're not expected to go back full time into the office. Although I did see something from the head of Goldman Sachs. Was he president or whatever it is of Goldman Sachs? Maybe it's the prime minister of Goldman Sachs, who knows? But, and he basically said he considers this whole remote working thing an aberration. And basically it's like, as soon as this is over, I expect everyone back in the office, which just made me laugh. I mean, that's Goldman Sachs view, but I mean, it doesn't represent the market.
What's your workforce numbers when that all happens?
It's like, it's like aberration is what we call, but the expectations will be different. So, employees will expect to be able to do a lot more things remotely.
Yeah.
And I think where you'll get to with some companies for certain roles, they'll get their laptop and they'll get something like this.
Agree.
Something like this, that that sort of incremental learning, right? So it's okay, I'm going to do half an hour in my, whatever a scenario, bang, on it goes. So that's going to drive the market as well, and that's going to be a fundamental change. And I think, across all those things, it's just expectations of what the employees are looking for. But and different areas are going to have, quicker or slower uptakes than others. I think anything that has that sort of risk element to it, if you can take risk out of your business, if you can make your employees safer, it's a no-brainer. Any kind of severe injury at work costs millions and millions of pounds.
So if you can reduce it.
Yeah,
exactly. Well, and I think, and to your point about the enterprise market, I think as the enterprise market picks up, that's only going to further drive the consumer market, because that again is going to be, well, if when you started a new company, you get your company cell phone, your company headset, and your laptop as just part of the standard package, well, that's going to start to create this environment where then people are using this on consumer grade because they have more exposure. And personally, this is one of the things that I think is a limiting factor is I don't know that a lot of people have actually experienced it. And so I think there's a lot of, ideas and, oh, this is what it's like. And it's like, have you actually done this before? And I'm surprised how many people have a very strong opinion on what VR will work for and won't work for. And then you ask, so have you done it?
Yeah.
Well, no, but I saw a video. I read an article. I'm an expert in VR, and you go, wait a minute. Like you have not experienced what this is like. If you're still operating off what you think it was 10 years ago based on a sci-fi video you watched, you're operating off a faulty premise.
And I've got a flip story to your story of enterprise driving consumer. So a really good story I heard recently from a chap called Walter over at Greco is, he'd been speaking to someone who asked for advice for speaking to someone about a business proposition who'd asked for advice about what headset to get for their child. Right. And I think they ended up getting a Quest because, it's one in the market at the moment. And then a little further down the track, turns out this guy had tried it. He was the CEO of some company. He was just like, we really need to look at it because this is technology. The hardest thing about marketing this is the best way to market it is for someone to try it.
I know. That's the hardest thing.
And it's a very hard thing to tell people about or explain. And therefore, if you try it, I mean, that was going to be sort of one part of the advice is like for anyone in the L&D space who is, needing to understand where things are moving forward, not just about VR, it's just try these things. Yeah. You have to try it. Get hold of one of these. There'll be any number of suppliers falling over themselves to get your business. They'll send you one, have a little play. You will then see what potential is.
As every L&D person watching this now is like, I'm going to send a request out to get my hands on one of these.
If you'd like my business, I would like 3 Oculus.
But the thing about it, and I think this is where, and Nick brought up a good point, and I think it's a little bit a redirect from where he's getting at, but I think this is where we in learning and development have a tremendous opportunity to help influence this right now. Because first of all, very few people have actually had experience with it. So when you're going and trying to explaining it and you're trying to tell them what it is, they either have no experience with it, or to Nick's point, they put one on and they went on a roller coaster and they felt nauseous and they went, oh, like this just, I can't imagine a world where we would use something like this. And I think that's where we're uniquely positioned to either do a lot of things to help accelerate this or a lot of things to send it down the wrong way, which is we have opportunity. We actually have loads of use cases, good use cases to say we can apply this. And if we do it right, it will open the doors for people to see the potential because they'll experience it and they'll experience a good example of it.
Yeah.
We can also destroy the efforts by, like we talked about earlier, just taking it from one box into another and going, hey, we want to run this experiment with VR where you can sit and watch our training videos with a headset on.
Yeah.
And people will go, yeah, kind of cool. I don't really see there being value. And suddenly now you've just sabotaged the potential.
Yeah, I do think sometimes, though, I don't think the industry, the VR or immersive tech sector has always done itself a great favor, because I think sometimes the people who really believe in it as the future, they they can kind of get people's backs up a bit by making out that it's the answer to all your training. It's kind of like you forget what you did. This is the future, and that I could understand why it would annoy people.
I agree.
Because the thing is, it's really good at doing some things, but it's not good at doing other things. And a lot of the stuff that's already happening still has great value and will continue to. And so I think it's important to say, VR is another tool to put in the training box, and it's a really good tool, by the way, but it's just another tool amongst many. It's not kind of, this doesn't change everything. It changes some.
It's not the panacea.
It's not it changes some things, it improves some things, it makes other things redundant, and it doesn't touch other areas. So I think there is a kind of responsibility on sort of people within the industry to go, it doesn't do everything, but it's bloody good at some things.
Yes.
And I think we have to do that more.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's a call out before to both sides, because I think some of that hype and buzz has been created by the industry that VR is the future and everybody's going to be sitting around in a headset in a chair. We're not going to have furniture or decorations in our house because we're just going to sit and that's going to be our world. And it's not. That's not going to be our world. And on the flip side, I think some of that has carried over into some of the excitement in learning and development, where we have opportunity to have more of a problem outcome focused mindset of saying, hey, before we start touting to everybody, we're going to do VR.
Yeah.
Let's think about what are some of the biggest challenges that we're struggling with. Yeah. Where can we not scale? Where are we lacking experience? Where are there safety concerns, effectiveness concerns with some of the things we're doing? Okay, now let's identify those. Let's back in and pressure test. Could VR actually be a solution to those problems? And if so, let's run some experiments and see if we can get the data to prove it. Because if we can do that, I can say from firsthand experience, if you go in with the data to show what you can do with this, nobody sends you back and goes, no, thanks. We'd actually rather do the more cost ineffective and more expensive. And, we just want to keep doing it the crummy way, despite all this data. Well, I won't say it never happens, but I would say it's very rare that conversation goes that way.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's a no-brainer, really. Just do a proof of concept, get some data out of it, and then see if it fits what you need to achieve for the business. Yeah. And if it doesn't, fine, move on. But if it does, plan for success, and look at how you roll it out. It's just simple, really.
Yeah, and I think the other point with that, because we're going to run out of time. There's about 500 other areas I want to go with this, so maybe we'll have to do a follow-up session. But I think to your point with that. That's one of my last questions is, what are one of the things that learning and HR leaders should think about with this? And I think that's probably the biggest takeaway from this is figure out what those problems, those challenges that you're trying to solve are first, then back into the tech and experiment with it. Don't go into it being like, we're going, I think of the digital transformation episode I had, I think last week, where it's like, we have $5 million and one chance to do it right. Like, don't approach it with that sense. Approach it from a experimental thing to see if you can get the data and then move it forward. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, you need to look at it from a perspective of, plan, do a proof of concept, then plan for success. Don't sort of be surprised when something works, then worry about how you're going to roll it out and how you're going to deploy it. You've got to think, okay, if this works, what does this mean for our business? How does it integrate with existing systems? You don't want duplication, you want integration. It's really straightforward. And all those sorts of things. And you should approach any business challenge in the same way. What do we need to solve?
This isn't just for VR.
Not for VR. Where do we need to get to? So we need to get our employees who are more skilled in this area. Okay, what's the best way to do it? And invariably it'll probably be a combination of a different number of things, right? One of those might be VR. But don't approach it like some technology that's landed from outer space. It is a tool that may suit what you need to achieve as a business, but don't get ahead and choose the tool before you've worked out what you need to do for the business.
Yep. And I think, kind of the final kind of wrapping note on that is just, alongside of that, Nathan mentioned it earlier. Don't let a bad experience poison the well. And I've seen that where somebody does an experiment, it didn't go quite how they thought, and they just write off VR as a whole
Yeah.
versus saying it didn't work here. So maybe it'll work over here, and continue with that experimentation mindset. And honestly, the advancements I've seen in this space in the last 5 years, things that you're like, well, VR won't work because of this.
Yeah.
And you're like, that's changed. I
Yeah.
mean, you think even hand tracking and some of these biometric data pieces, it's like you can do things now that you couldn't a few years ago. So
I think in the L&D community, if you haven't tried it, at some
you have
point
to try it.
you're probably not doing as good a job as you could, if I'm really honest.
Yeah. All right. Well, we will we'd end up talking the rest of the day if we just kept going. So I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you to everyone who joined us. This was a great discussion. Hopefully this shaped your thinking a little bit differently, gave you some exposure to some things, and it's so thanks for all the comments, all the interaction. This was a blast. But I wish you all a fantastic weekend. I hope you have a good one. James, I hope you have a great weekend. And we will stay in touch. So have a good one.
Thanks a lot.